Hi, everybody. Welcome to the lecture on the early 1960s. This is what happens during this decade. If we remember back in the 1950s, rock and roll exploded onto the scene. 1955, country music, rock and roll, jazz, and swing all came together to form this new genre called rock. It was simple, it was an AAB form. It was white people often imitating black or rhythm and blues sentiments. It was both urban and rural because of television. It was rebellious. It was new. It was more personal, even though there was a strong commercial push behind it. Bands were smaller. Groups were smaller. People were writing their own songs now. Instruments became very simple: drums, bass, guitar. Recording quality was improving. It was being distributed on FM radio and, of course, again, television. This is about the baby boomer generation, and we're at the peak of modernity, the point at which mankind has truly conquered nature through science and reason. The Cold War is in effect, and nationalism and anti-communism is very strong. The music is about dancing. We want to dance to it. Just as fast as early rock burst onto the scene in 1955, it went out with a thud in the late 1950s. If you will remember, our artists were Bill Haley, Elvis Presley, Little Richard, Jerry Lee Lewis, Buddy Holly, Ritchie Valens, and Chuck Berry. These artists together represented rockabilly, which is the term we use for early rock and roll, the music that had that strong influence of R&B, country, and swing or jazz. But between 1957 and 1960, almost all these artists disappear. Bill Haley's popularity wanes when Elvis Presley shows up. Elvis Presley goes into the army. Little Richard goes back into gospel music. Jerry Lee Lewis marries his 12 or 13-year-old niece and gets banished. Buddy Holly and Ritchie Valens both die in the same plane accident, and Chuck Berry gets put in prison for transporting a 14-year-old girl across state lines under the allegations that he had had sex with her. So these early rock and rollers burst onto the scene quickly and burnt out very quickly, thus establishing rock and roll as a truly rebellious and exciting genre. So what's going to emerge out of this now? What comes out of these ashes? Well, it's a strange time in rock and roll, and it seems like for a while that maybe that genre is over, that those 5 years were all that rock and roll had to offer. There are 5 main genres that began to emerge in the late 60s, and I want to talk about them. The first genre is a new form of pop music that is much more similar to rock and roll in terms of instrumentation, orientation, danceability, song form, and musical elements than jazz was. A subset of pop we're going to look at is called Motown. Another subset of pop is called novelty songs. A small number of artists were able to still be successful in the rockabilly style, and there was a dance music genre that began to emerge as part of that. Perhaps the most dominant genre during the time was folk rock. And lastly, we had the emergence of surfer rock. The industry really consolidated during rockabilly, with a large focus on these artists, and then rockabilly really fragmented into these different genres. For a while, rock and roll is going to be trying to find itself. Let's talk about some of the particular artists that were involved in these different genres and what made them. So first I want to talk about the pop genre, and there's a couple artists that I have here to represent that. One of them is the Four Seasons. The Four Seasons were headed by Frankie Valli. You'll hear they have a fairly unique singing style. Frankie Valli has one of the higher voices of the time, and in fact, one of the things that becomes very popular in the early 1960s is extremely high falsetto singing. We'll hear that in the pop music and the surfer music with the Beach Boys and that sort of thing. So I'd like you to take a listen to the Four Seasons. They were one of the most successful bands of the early 60s before the Beatles showed up. You'll recognize some of their songs: Sherry, Big Girls Don't Cry. Another genre related to pop that we will not have time to go into, unfortunately, is Motown. And Motown, the song that I have there is by the Marvelettes. Please Mr. Postman was the first #1 hit from Motown Records, and we'll talk a little bit more about what Motown was. We'll talk a little bit more about Motown when we talk about Berry Gordy and the role of a producer. But Motown was a commercial popular music production system similar to Tin Pan Alley, only it was owned and operated, and the music was performed by African Americans and sold to white Americans. It was really capitalizing on that crossover appeal that had been discovered with R&B music back in the rockabilly days. For the example of novelty music, we're going to listen to the Tokens, and you'll probably recognize this song too, The Lion Sleeps Tonight. There are several of these novelty type songs coming out in the early 60s, and if you do a Google search just on novelty songs, you'll see a lot of them. Itsy Bitsy, Teensy Weensy, Yellow Polka Dot Bikini, The Monster Mash, Lion Sleeps Tonight, those sort of things. The music that was most similar to rockabilly was what we call dance music. Now, before the early 1960s, in order to dance, you had to go and dance with a partner. You didn't just dance on your own. In the early 60s, the idea that you could go dance by yourself to a song really emerged, and the song that was most famous for that was The Twist by Chubby Checker. And so Chubby Checker, kind of all on his own, is going to maintain that idea of rock and roll being about dancing and partying, while these other genres tend to move towards more pop rock sentimental music or the more serious folk rock music. Folk rock was probably the most dominant rock form of the time, and it began with the Kingston Trio, and we'll listen to their song Tom Dooley. Also, Peter, Paul, and Mary were one of the largest acts of the time. They actually performed at the March on Washington for civil rights. Folk rock music becomes the anthem music for the beginning of the civil rights movement in the early 60s. When we hear this folk rock music, the last thing we're going to probably think is rebellious, but at the time it was, because civil rights was a very hot topic. If you remember, I talked about folk music back in the 1930s with Woody Guthrie, and then I talked about Pete Seeger and the Weavers, and they had been banned or blacklisted in the 50s because their music was considered communist or socialist, because it was questioning the way our society runs. Well, folk music is going to continue to do that. It's going to continue to bring that idea of questioning how our country operates and how people are treated within it. And that's going to be a very important part of rock and roll for the next decade or so. And we see that thread continuing with the folk rock movement. Another important artist during that time in folk rock was Joan Baez, who has one of the more beautiful voices you'll hear, and Bob Dylan. Bob Dylan was probably the most influential artist of the early 60s. Bob Dylan, Joan Baez, Peter, Paul, and Mary, Kingston Trio start to reject the instrumentation, the form, the purpose, the style, the tempo of early rock music by using only acoustic guitars or long drawn-out songs. Some of Bob Dylan's songs have 9, 10 verses in them, sometimes with no chorus, for example. Meaning of the song becomes more reflective. Peter, Paul, Mary talked about early rock and roll not being real music because it wasn't serious enough. So folk music starts to have this very serious perspective to it, especially on social matters. And again, it becomes that soundtrack to the 60s, which is going to be a decade of transformation and change for the entire country. Now, that doesn't mean everything's serious. We still are going to party a little bit, and surfer music is going to help fill that role along with the dance music, and the Beach Boys are going to introduce that sound from California, and it's going to have the California sound with the same instrumentation as rockabilly, but the songs will change in their form into more of an AAB form with a verse and a chorus. So these are the main genres that we're going to be talking about in the early 60s, and these are the main artists that I'd like you to know. Over here you'll see the songs, and I'd like you to be able to identify all those songs and those artists. Those will be on the quizzes. If we go over to the rock music timeline and look at the 1960s, you're going to see it's filled primarily with the Beatles, and I haven't even talked about them yet. They're going to show up in 1964 and change everything. All of these genres will essentially disappear when the Beatles come in, and again, music will consolidate, rock and roll will consolidate into a new stylistic form that the Beatles introduce, which we will call psychedelic rock, and that will be the latter part of the 60s. If we come over to the rock music timeline, you'll see, so looking back on this rock music timeline, it's hard now to see these bands from the early 60s. The Beach Boys are about the only band that we see there. If we click on the years below here, we can see what was happening before the Beatles showed up, and you'll see that Elvis Presley is still making #1 songs. This is right after he gets back in the army, and Elvis manages to continue his popularity, but it shifts. His audience becomes more mature, and he's going to head out to Vegas pretty soon and be involved in that scene. You'll see Chubby Checker here that we talked about slightly, and then you'll see a lot of pop music songs. Here's the Yellow Polka Dot Bikini song, and if you listen through these songs, rock and roll is not what comes to mind. You'll see that rock and roll starts to disappear off the charts in the early 60s. I can go to 61 and I can see some of the same thing. Elvis Presley selling a lot of records, but not a lot of other big rock artists other than Chubby Checker. So rock and roll starts to go underground and yet still maintains popularity with this folk and surfer music. This will become one of the defining features of rock and roll, is that it can be #1 or it can be underground. For example, Led Zeppelin never produces a #1 hit and yet is one of the top selling artists of all time. So now as we go to the book, we can see how they emphasize the 1960s as being a very dramatic decade. In fact, I would say the 1960s and the 1920s were the two most extreme decades in America during the 20th century in terms of social and political change. The big influence on this decade, again, is the baby boomer generation. Now they're teenagers becoming adults, and rock and roll is going to develop and change with them. As the book points out, the early 1960s was kind of an innocent, lackluster period in the development of rock and roll. Most of the music was not very rebellious or edgy. There's sort of a pre-teen innocence about it. The pop, Motown, novelty, dance, and surfer music doesn't have a lot of depth to it. People aren't going crazy and acting like wild men on stage as much. Folk music has a depth to it socially, but it's very toned down, and audiences are expected to listen and take the music seriously. In a lot of the ways, it's hard to call this music rock. As I had said earlier, Chubby Checker managed to keep the idea of keeping dance as a fundamental part of rock and roll with his song The Twist. And that song, The Twist, is tied in with this television show called American Bandstand, which is a television show that was marketed to teenage baby boomers. So when someone came out with a new song, they would try to get on American Bandstand, similar to the way someone tries to get on Saturday Night Live, and teenagers would be dancing to the music on the show. Chubby Checker did his version of The Twist there, and it went crazy. It became a #1 hit, and it started what is called the dance craze. What do I mean by that? Well, I had said earlier that you used to have to dance with a partner. Now, for the first time, you could do this silly little dance, and if you watch the video of The Twist, you'll see how basic it is. The idea that you could dance with yourself and anyone who was around you. This idea of free-form dancing gave rise to discotheques or clubs, and these clubs popped up all over in the cities. The Peppermint Lounge was one of the biggest, and The Twist was so popular that it got released and became #1 a second time, only the second song to ever do that. So when we go to a club now and dance on our own, we don't think anything about it. It seems fairly normal. At the time, that was pretty radical. And as the book points out, we have Chubby Checker and The Twist to thank for being able to go out and dance on our own without having to find a date. I want to take a quick pause to touch back on something we discussed last week. If you remember, as the recorded music became the dominant form of transmitting music instead of printed sheets, the role of the producer became more and more important. And if you remember, the producer is the person who brings together the artist and the record company with the songwriter and the publisher to produce a recording. Well, these producers became very powerful, and the 60s shows us 3 of these very powerful producers. The first one is Phil Spector, the second one is Berry Gordy, and the third one is George Martin. Phil Spector was really involved in the popular music of the early 60s and developed what they called a wall of sound, where he would overdub additional instruments to make the sound bigger than it could be performed in real time. He was the first producer whose name really became a household name, similar to an artist or a writer. He became a multi-millionaire by the time he was 24. And Phil Spector was very popular for having these girl groups where there were 3 to 4 women singing in front of a band that had rock and roll instruments. In some ways, this became like Tin Pan Alley. It became a commercial music producing process. So I'm going to put Phil Spector up here as an important person, as the producer. And then I'm also going to now add Berry Gordy. And Berry Gordy is the same thing for Motown that Phil Spector was for pop music. Berry Gordy started Motown in Detroit, and as I had said earlier, it is an African-American run corporation. It will produce very commercialized music, many of it with girl groups, but the girl groups are going to be African-American. The musicians playing the songs will be the same for many of the artists, and many of the famous artists that we know are going to come from Motown. That includes people like Diana Ross and the Supremes, Stevie Wonder, and the Jackson 5 and Michael Jackson. Though this was run by African Americans, the music was targeted at white Americans, and it was designed to make money off younger Americans. These are the pre-teens and early teens in the baby boomer generation. The song that I'd like you to know that best demonstrates Motown is Please Mr. Postman. It was a #1 hit in 1961. One of the biggest artists to come out of Motown was Diana Ross and the Supremes, and through the 60s, they will be about the only group to be able to compete with the Beatles in terms of #1 hits. The Beach Boys best represented the surfer sound, and I think we all are very familiar with that sound. They make use of a lot of echo and reverb, fairly clean guitar sounds, high male falsetto voices similar to the Four Seasons, pop music sentiments, but a distinct quality to the sound that associates it with Southern California life and surfer music. The Beach Boys will be the biggest American band in the early part of the 60s. But this genre is never going to take off and become its own genre. It becomes similar to novelty, kind of a special thing. It's very placed in its time. And their first major hit was Surfin' USA, which came out in 1963. And you'll see that there's a lot of influence from Chuck Berry in this song. And they're not afraid to make use of some of the early rockabilly form. But the lyrics are always fairly shallow. Fun, fun, fun. Happy, light, innocent-sounding music. Now, the textbook does not do a very good job of covering folk music, which is a bit surprising because of its importance in the early 60s. I'd like you to be familiar with these 4 artists here and their songs. which I have included on the artist database right here and on the YouTube playlist. The Kingston Trio song Tom Dooley is a fairly dark, disturbing song. I'm sure that you will be surprised when you hear it. For it to be coming out in 1958, right at the tail end of the party period of early rock and roll. I mean, this is still when we're supposed to be dancing around with Little Richard and Jerry Lee Lewis. They bring in the idea of being able to sell thousands of records using only acoustic instruments. And there's a rebellion against that early rockabilly sound. Joan Baez takes advantage of it too. You'll hear Peter, Paul, and Mary, and you'll hear Bob Dylan. As you listen to Peter, Paul, and Mary, I'd like you to know that these songs were influenced, and some of them written by Pete Seeger and the Weavers and the early folk rock artists, and that the social commentary in the music is very important. Again, they were one of the main performers at the March on Washington for Civil Rights. As you listen to Bob Dylan's music, you'll notice that the lyrics become more important. In some ways, this is the first rap music, meaning that instead of the melody and the chorus being very important, that it's the contents of the words that are important and how they're put together. Sometimes the words don't even quite make sense, but they create a sense of imagery that's important in conveying what the artist is trying to express. So in 1964, the Beatles show up. And you can ask anyone who was alive at the time, where were they when John Kennedy was shot, and where were they when the Beatles played on The Ed Sullivan Show? The Ed Sullivan Show was a show similar to American Bandstand. Instead of having teenagers dance to the music, though, Ed Sullivan would introduce new acts. Started in the late 1940s and it ran all the way until the early 1970s. And if you wanted to make it as an artist, you either got on to American Bandstand or The Ed Sullivan Show. And everybody knew that, and then everybody had heard about the Beatles. So when the Beatles finally came over and got on The Ed Sullivan Show, it was huge. When you go and begin listening to the Beatles, I want you to compare these songs, their early songs, I Want to Hold Your Hand or She Loves You, against the songs that had been around for the 5 years previously, from Tom Dooley all the way through the later Bob Dylan. And I'm hoping you can hear in that this is, in a large part, a revival of rock and roll. Meaning some of that late 1960s sound, especially Chuck Berry with that kind of rockin', aggressive and assertive sound, is going to come back. And the instrument that it comes back perhaps the most strongly in is the drum set. And the first time when you hear I Want to Hold Your Hand, you'll hear how strong the drums are, how powerful they are compared to the way they had been played before. In jazz music, the bass would hold the beat. In rock and roll, it's the drums that hold the beat. The Beatles are going to be radical because they are going to have long, unkept hair. They're going to be British. They're very likable, and they're very funny. They're going to show up in 1963, 64, 64 on Ed Sullivan Show. These songs came out in 63, but they didn't come to America until 1964. And by 1967, they and the entire world will have changed. We're going to start that journey in the next lecture when we talk about the late 60s, because it's so important what happens in America from 64 to 68, 69. When the Beatles arrived on the Ed Sullivan Show in 1964, America was just coming to terms with the assassination of JFK in 1963. And the Beatles were very popular already over in Europe, so Capitol, their record company, had really started promoting them here in the U.S. And we're using the model of Frank Sinatra or Elvis Presley to help create the idea of the rock star. If you remember, one of our themes is Black America, White America, or British. And the reason that I create that theme is that with the Beatles, we start to see the first international influence on American popular music. Up to this point, white American and black Americans have been imitating each other. Urban and rural Americans have been passing information back and forth in styles. Meanwhile, over in England, they had been influenced by this American music, and so when the rockabilly music disappeared in the early 60s, and America began listening more to pop, dance, folk, surfer, and sort of this innocent music, the British people were still listening to Chuck Berry, Buddy Holly, and the early rock and rollers. So they were influenced by American music, put their British twist on it, and brought it back to the United States with a new identity and attitude attached to it. And from then on, British musicians are going to be the dominant musicians in rock and roll until the 80s and 90s. And in fact, most of the top-selling artists of all time are British rock and roll artists. The Beatles were the first. Some of the other artists who came over very early were The Who, the Rolling Stones, and the Kinks. We'll talk about The Who and Rolling Stones later in the second half of the 1960s. The Beatles' influence was instant, similar to the way that rock and roll burst on the scene in 1955. In 1964, Beatlemania is going to burst on the scene and change the whole paradigm. And this period in between, in a large part, is going to be forgotten. We're still familiar with some of these songs. None of these artists are going to sell the most records, and some of them you may have never heard of before this class, like the Kingston Trio. Most of the artists after 1964, after the Beatles come, you probably will recognize. And what was amazing about the Beatles is not only was there this much hype about them, but they actually lived up to it. They became the most popular band in the world. They still are the most popular band in the world. And they become the most creative and unique bands ever, meaning that their style changes and evolves radically from album to album. And we begin to introduce into the idea of rock and roll transformation, that rock and roll can change as an art form. And because it survives from rockabilly through the early 60s into the Beatles, it becomes stronger and able to incorporate new ideas in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and even early 2000s. No other genre is able to maintain its high level of popularity and transform as much as rock and roll was for this 50-year period from 55 to 2005. If you listen to country music, hip hop music, jazz music, there are some radically different styles within them, but the styles that sold millions and millions of records tend to be fairly similar in terms of form, instrumentation, tempo, purpose, social perspective, lyrics. Whereas rock and roll, even on the same album, the songs can sound totally different from each other. And that idea is introduced here, right in 64, 65, as we start to move into the psychedelic era. So I'm going to stop the lecture there with the Beatles coming in 1964 and some of their early songs. I would like you to know them. Please take a look at the course module and make sure that you can complete all the assignments this week, and let me know if you have any questions. Thanks.